I do welcome you all to this panel section on B+ masculinities. I'm Aurelio Castro, your chair, and I'm a researcher and psychologist actually working too on Bi+ masculinities here in Italy, and really interested and in hearing all of your topics and research and performances. So I do just remember you that you have 10-12 minutes if you want to leave a few minutes for questions, but we have 4 speakers, so that means it's 15 minutes each before going to the next panel. So I ask Ritch, Professor Ritch Savin-Williams, is going to talk about as many men as women are bisexual from Cornell University, USA. Is he here? Can you hear me? I guess maybe people are coming from the other panel, so just let me check if anybody else is here. Andrew Milnes, yes, I can see them. Luke Shackelford and Rowan House. Okay, I can see them too. Please, you can. I think you can talk. Yes, you can activate your audio. Does it work? Please give me some feedback. I feel alone.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay.
Awesome.
Okay, so I think we just miss Ritch. I guess you can. We have to start, unfortunately. Okay, so then I'll just throw a dice and let's go with Andrew. Would you like to start and break the ice?
Yes, for sure. And I should just apologize. I've got a bit of a halo with my camera, but my camera wasn't actually working before, and it is now, so you can actually see me. But yeah, so I'll do my.
Don't worry, you look great.
I try. So I just want to introduce myself first. My name's Andrew Milnes. My pronouns are he and them. And I'm talking to you from Adelaide in Australia. I'm currently on Gauna land, so the Gauna are the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, and I want to pay respects to their elders past and present, and note that sovereignty was never ceded. So I also wanted to just do a little bit of a disclaimer. In the talk that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be using some kind of binary language like men and women. Now, even though the binary, as we know, isn't actually real necessarily, it's still an oppressive construct. And so I will need to utilize some of those terms like that. I want to emphasize that when I'm talking about bi men in this context, I'm talking about cis men, trans men, and also non-binary people who identify in some way or agree with the category of men. So it's a quite inclusive, broad, terminology of talking about bi men. And so I wanted to start this by saying I'm actually here a bit as an imposter. So so I wanted to talk about this from the position of imposter syndrome, which is, I know, something that bi people kind of often identify with. We often feel in some ways, some of us, that we're imposters. And I use the metaphor of imposter in a few ways. So one of those was around that I'm not here as an academic or an academically accredited as researcher, unlike lots of people who've been speaking before. However, I am, and so my background is actually in journalism, marketing, and not-for-profits. However, I'm actually talking here from lived experience as a bi-pan man. And I want to emphasize that's something that a lot of academics who've studied bi-pan men or bi men have not actually done. They've come from sort of other kind of frameworks and backgrounds. So as someone, following on about the imposter syndrome, I'm someone who I've often felt an imposter in straight spaces and an imposter in gay ones. But I've also felt sometimes in bi spaces a little bit of an imposter too, as someone who identifies mostly as a man, as someone who has been mostly same gender focused in a lot of my relationship history, and also as someone who is no longer young. So, and I'll talk about why that might be in a bit. We'll talk about framing. But so I'm here as an imposter talking from lived experience, which makes me a weird specimen for researchers. So I'm an actual bisexual man, an actual older bisexual man. The other thing about being an imposter is that it can sometimes be illuminating in terms of what it says about situations, like who is let into a certain scenario and who's kept out, whose voices are heard and who's actually not. So I'm going to be an imposter and also a little bit impertinent in some ways, hopefully not too much, but in terms of some of the questions I'll be raising and looking at. So, and part of what I wanted to discuss was to pose some of these questions and hopefully have some of these musings ripple across different networks and communities so that it starts people thinking. I'll be talking about these often from my observational experience and a lot of it from an Australian context, but I'm sure there's parts of it that are, applicable across. So my background, I'm a bi-pan man who originally came out in my 20s as gay. So that was the label that seemed to fit at the time, even though it didn't really, but it was the only label that I could actually sort of really access or felt I could. And then I came out in my 30s as bi-pan. I'd had various different sexuality labels in my life. I've had various relationship labels in my life, and I've continued explorations around gender throughout my life. So when I was a young queer man in the 80s and 90s, and queer is actually the label I feel most comfortable with, I should say, there were no bi role models. There were, particularly for men, I did not know a single bi visible out person in the society, and I didn't know any in the community either. And there was no bi community. There was a gay community that I could access, but there was no bi community. So that's where I grew up in Adelaide. That was what it was like. This was in the midst of the HIV crisis, and in many ways, I still consider myself fortunate that I'm alive today, because particularly given the repression of queer communities during that time, and also how much bi men particularly were invisibilized and demonized, and there was all this rhetoric around they are the vectors of the gay disease, which was what HIV/AIDS was seen. Originally, it was called GRID, which was related to gay immune deficiency or something like that. They were seen as, we were seen as passing this on to the straight community. So this was kind of the scenario when I was sort of growing up, when I was a young man. So this is why I consider myself fortunate that I am still alive today, because a lot of my compatriots aren't necessarily, So as someone who's a queer survivor of those times and engaged in wider LGBTI struggles since and bi struggles, I wanted to ask a few questions, and this is of the wider culture and academics and researchers. It's of the broader queer community, but also the organised bi community. But before I kind of get to my questions, I want to just quickly set a context. So what's the societal picture of bisexual? You ask someone go out and ask a person in the street, tell me what a bisexual looks like, right? What you're probably going to get from the average person is young, white, middle-class, able-bodied, all the standard the standard defaults and templates of our culture. Yet interestingly, you won't often necessarily get male bisexual, you get female. Why is that? Well, I think I have a belief in this, and I think there's been quite a bit of research around this, that those concepts have been framed by the people with power in our society, which is white cishet men. White cishet men set the tone for the culture, and they're the ones with power who permeate these knowledges. And this is about their fantasies and projections. So cishet men fantasize by women as existing, however, also often, well, they'll really go straight in the end. This is their scenario, the way they envision it. And also the sexuality of bi women existing mainly for those men's pleasure. So which, it leads, and that actually leads bi women to being subjected to very high levels of male violence, and that's been documented. Whereas bisexual men are often invisibilized, demonized, or not seen to exist at all. And this is partly because we incarnate cishet men's fears, their own fears and anxieties. So given this framing that I've mentioned before, I want to ask, what do we really know about bi men in our society broadly? Why is there such a dearth, relatively, of bi male voices in the culture, even still today? And why such a dearth or limited amount of research? Because it seems to me there is a big gap or lack of knowledge around bi men in their lives, particularly speaking to those or bi men and getting their knowledge. And I know there's a lot of reasons why, but this is even more so than bi people in general, it seems, both in the form of specific research, but also general cultural knowledge. And this relative absence of bi men and awareness or visibility of them in the society is something I have frequently encountered, not just in the wider society, but in broader queer spaces and even in the bi community itself. So, for example, I've often been the only bi man when I'm in broader queer groups, or the only out one. And I've also often been only one of a few male or AMAB non-binary people in bi groups or networks that I've been in, on panels or different groups or conferences or things. Also, while I'm aware of male or AMAB non-binary people who are bi activists, they're far more scarce than women bi activists, and that's something that's been, noted. So, I mean, even this is sort of an example. It's great this is happening, this talk. It's great, this channel, even though it's sort of this brief channel. But I haven't encountered something like this specifically about bi men in a lot of previous bi conferences I've been at. And I've been attending them on and off for about 20 years. So I think that sort of says some significant stuff. So, and this is also particularly interesting given how sensitive bi spaces often are regarding gender and inclusion, particularly related to trans, non-binary and gender diverse people. So, very much to by our credit. They're not spaces that are oblivious to the complexities of gender, though, of course, there's transphobia and that needs to be dealt with. That exists, unfortunately, across the wider society. But in a lot, bi spaces have been a lot more enlightened than a lot of even queer spaces around gender diversity. So why is there this silence and dearth around bi men? In the broader culture, in the queer community, and sometimes often in the bi community, and what does our silence say? So I just want to kind of say, I don't think it says that bi men does not exist, and I think a later speaker will be talking about this, in the same numbers as bi women. Cultural and historical studies show we have existed across many cultures, so why are we particularly invisibilized in ours and not centered? So, and the other thing following on from that is a lot of research about bi men, even up to this day, is about our existence. So, proving we exist. I mean, there was a study even in 2020, that's 2 years ago, oh yes, no, bi men exist, we've proven it. Scientists, and it's like, well, would anyone kind of credibly do a study in 2020 in a Western institution that gay men or lesbians exist? They would be like pilloried, and yet, our debate, our existence is still sort of up for debate, even within realms that it shouldn't be. And even when research is done, so I know Maria's present here today, and Maria's done some great research with bi men and their partners, and she wrote a wonderful book a few years back about relationships with bi men and their partners, which was really great, and everyone should get it. But the other thing that I remember reading it, thinking, well, this is still framed from the partner's perspective, which is important. We don't hear those women's perspective, and it needs to be heard. But what about the bi men's perspective? When do we get sort of more focus on that? So, and, I want to say that if this happened in other spaces, if there was queer spaces, that there was a significant gender imbalance in general queer spaces, or in spaces with people of color or whatever, we'd be kind of going, well, what's happening here? And yet it's often sometimes not even really remarked upon, or it's sort of just assumed, or we just know that there's not as many bi men, they're not here, they're not coming, whatever. What I would say is, if the absence, missing nature of these men isn't talked about in bi spaces, where will it be talked about? Because it won't be talked about in straight spaces, and it won't be talked about in gay spaces. And therefore, those men who are out there, closeted or in denial or struggling or don't even know what they are, how will they get their support? What does this say in terms of the community and accountability to the broader community? So, yeah, and also, like, growing up as a bi-pan man in the 80s, I never saw images of me. But yeah, I'm a white, able-bodied, middle-class person. So how is it for someone who's a bi man who has marginalized intersectional identities, if they're Black, poor, Muslim, disabled, if they can't even find them, if I couldn't find myself, how will they find themselves? So I know things have gotten a lot better now, but it seems to me there's still a lack of visible bi role models, and particularly bi men, and particularly older bi men. So I want to wrap up quickly because I know I'm getting to time. But I just want to say a few sort of caveats in the final thing. So I think I wanted to have a discussion or mention this for further discussion, but I think there are some things we need to frame it with And I think there are some myths that are floated around, unfortunately, that we need to kind of, you know, put aside. So I think it's important to frame this in the context of patriarchy and patriarchal and heteronormative privilege, because as we know, all men have patriarchal privilege. And so that's a framework that why is it particularly that by men, there's sort of this challenge of, you know, this seems to be a particular challenge in this setting, but it can't be slated solely to homophobia, because we've known that many, many gay men have come out since Stonewall in the last 50 years, and the gay community has sort of blossomed. And yet bi people are actually proportionally more in the community, and yet we haven't necessarily seen this, what specifically is going on here. The other myth I would, you know, definitely say we shouldn't, you know, we should put aside is the myth some people have said that bi women are somehow less oppressed than bi men. Now, there is no doubt this is incorrect and wrong. And, you know, I want to be clear about that in my talk. I think it's more of a case of the oppressions bi men and women face are obviously sometimes similar, but often different or manifest in different ways. And there's also been quite a bit of research done about this, you know, women being hypersexualized by women and bi men invisibilized or demonized. So, you know, and also I want to note that in the main, where bi spaces exist and communities, they've been made and sustained by the work of bi women. Another myth that has been going around is that bi men...
Andrew, apologies. You just have, if you can wrap up because you're running out of time. You run out of time.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sure. So another myth is bi men don't come out and come to bi spaces because of fear of loss of male privilege, but I haven't seen evidence to be conclusive about that. But what the lack of bi men does say is it raises questions about whether bi spaces and community or bisexuality as an identity are problematic, unwelcoming, or appealing for many bi men, and if so, why? So I want to finish by saying I hope this talk opens up some conversations and thinking about this, about why this might be the case, and a way for our community to get to be more not only sensitive to bi men and bi men's needs, but also more thinking about inclusion, diversity, and accessibility and accountably more broadly. So yeah, that's
Thank you, Andrew. That was an amazing discussion and report about your experiences and what it means to be bi plus men, and also how it intersects with different range of oppression. And I had a question from one of the public. If you can tell again the book that you mentioned. If you can write on the chat to the reference, please.
Well, I was going to say Maria's actually here, so I can't remember the name exactly, but Maria might be able to.
Maria, Border Families or Women in Relationship with Bisexual Men? Or
that one, the Women in Relationships with Bisexual Men, and it's yeah, it's an excellent book.
Quite familiar with the work. Thanks again, Maria, for writing such good things. Okay, thank you, Andrew. Then I'll call the next speaker, and if Luke Shackelford could just share their screen, and they will talk about bi masculinity as pedagogy in Midwestern activism. So
thank you, everybody, and thank you, Andrew, for the really interesting sharing of lived experience. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Once I do, please let me know if you can see it. So is that visible? Cool. Let me go ahead and start this. All right. Let me move this off to the side. Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm Luke, a fourth-year PhD student over at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in our Writing Studies, Rhetoric, Scientific, and Technical Communications program. I'm here to share some preliminary findings from my research focusing on the activist engagement of bi men and masked folk here in the Midwest. I'm very excited and proud to be part of this conference and to start to contribute to the bi community for the first time, really. This is my first time ever going to a bi specific conference, so I'm really excited about that. First, I'd want to give some historical context and research context on some context on the research study. The study is a 3-phase qualitative research project related to my dissertation research. The short version is that I'm studying the rhetoric that contributes to how bi plus men and masked folk are made, rhetoric both employed by a medical community that wishes to medicalize us for various reasons, and an activist community that hopes to enable us to speak and be heard. This presentation focuses on findings in the first phase, which is primarily about rediscovering historical participation, analyzing the way masked bi folk do or do not demonstrate their existence or share values to broader queer communities and specific bi communities. I'm happy to talk about the other parts of the study, like the medicine and biologistic focuses, more detailed research questions through email or the question period. The data comes from the John Nicholas Treader Collection in Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Studies here in the University of Minnesota Twin Cities libraries. The data includes 2 sets of archival materials, boxes for detailing administrative and activist efforts from a local org called the Bisexual Organizing Project, or the BOP, containing documentation of their activism from 1988 to 2009. It also includes a digital collection of a local program, the Bi Cities television program, containing 302 episodes of the program from its inception in 2002 to current airings as recent as 2020. During the process, over 886 separate files were recorded and annotated and organized in this first stage. In addition, 10 long-form interviews were analyzed through the Bi Cities TV show. Artifacts were analyzed through autoethnographic vignettes. This is a methodology that essentially involves following up extended archival visits with long-form narrative reflections on the emotional and intellectual experience with the materials themselves. I used my own experience as a masked bi researcher to connect these artifacts together using rhetorical queer and masculinity theory to understand the potential effects of these performances in a queer community. I do want to clarify my exploration of masculinity. While there's an endless wealth of theory on masculinity in feminist, queer, and rhetorical studies, in public discourse, we often reduce masculinity to a singular or several damaging sets of prescriptive norms and systems, commonly referred to as toxic or hegemonic masculinity. I'm primarily concerned with the application of inclusive masculinities as defined by Anderson's work, which argues through observational studies that one way men can disrupt cultural scripts is to generate positive models or communities of men that do not tolerate or abide by hegemonic norms, so refusing to tolerate transphobia or biphobia in a specific community. My interest is therefore uncovering descriptively how men have rhetorically performed in activist spaces. If we can describe possible behaviors associated with masculine individuals that can also be inclusive and responsive to a wider community, this can provide models for other masked bi folk for how to get involved in activist efforts. I'm interested in how descriptive masculine performances can serve to teach other masked bi folk how to engage with an activist community and a queer community for the first time. To show a small piece of my research, I put together a sort of case study from some artifacts in the archive that I've been working on. The case study focuses on one of the more high-profile members of the early Minnesota community, William E. Burleson, or Bill, a bisexual activist informed by queer and bi feminism, who did most of his activist work in the 1990s through the mid-2000s. Bill's name permeates the BOP archives, including his help establishing the BOP. He served as a co-chair, often organizing events, serving as a grant writer and community writer, coordinating local Because conferences and workshops. Bill also facilitated bisexual men's support groups in the still active Men's Center here in the Twin Cities, and served the larger community, contributing as a health column writer for the local gay mag Lavender magazine, and a counselor in health interventions for men, HIM, a program that was dedicated to providing sexual health awareness and HIV testing to men who have sex with men. Bill also established and produced the Bi Cities TV show, still running today in an online format, though without Bill's involvement. Finally, Bill helped coordinate the Bi History Project with project lead Mark Schuler, a collection of interviews from other activists in the same time period, using it as foundational data for his book, Bi America, which contains a partial record of those interviews, so the full records exist here in the archives. Bill here already models several methods of involvement with bi and queer communities, creating spaces where bi-mass communities can form and speak judgment-free on their struggles and focuses in the larger queer community, investing in the preserving of his local community history, and dedicating material time and effort to the development and funding of organizational efforts, not to count the contribution to education and awareness to resist medical stereotypes, especially in sexual health and pleasure for bi men. Bill provides a helpful paradigm case for how many bi men engage with the community in similar capacities during this time frame. In his engagement, I found 3 different rhetorical strategies modeled to both grow and develop an inclusive queer community, one of which I'll share today. The most common rhetorical tactic of bi men I've encountered during this time frame is a twofold argument I've been calling in my notes: I'm mad and disappointed. This is an epidietic explain that establishes the failings of the gay community to curb biphobia, despite shared oppression with bi folk, and then slyly points to apathy towards our differences in the straight community, or even the straight community's relative acceptance of bisexual individuals, to 1, provoke inclusive responses from the gay and lesbian community, and 2, express inclusion as a core value of their local bi communities. The grounding narrative for this approach is best represented by Bill in 2002 on episode 4 of Bi Cities, where he states a narrative he believes is far too common with bi men, enjoying being heavily involved in the gay male social network of gay culture, only for his community to disintegrate after his choice to partner with a woman, after which the gay community would no longer support his, quote, violation of cultural taboos and community norms. This story is shared repeatedly, also mentioned in his book, as a motivator for joining a bi-specific community to various degrees. The lack of inclusion for his experience and people like him serves as a catalyst for trying to develop a truly inclusive community all our own. Bill also often critiqued biphobia in the Twin Cities gay community, especially in their dismissal of bi issues, arguing that shared oppression ought to make gay and lesbian communities more willing to work with bi communities than they actually are. For example, in this 2003 issue of Lavender magazine, he responds to a commentary from a previous issue that argued for a reduction in bisexual support because bisexuals make, quote, really bad gays. Bill responds first by establishing his credentials, stating his activist presence in the community, lamenting that it never would be enough to prove his queerness, despite the fact that homophobic oppressors don't care much to differentiate between bi and gay individuals. In his reply, he displays alliance with several other communities he sees as marginalized in the wider gay community, such as trans, disabled, and lower class members of the Twin Cities. On its face, his response and many other letters to the editor in this issue seems to succeed, as this very same issue showcases a often cited piece in the area by Liz Heileman on bisexual history, almost like the issue was compensating for its biphobic presence in the previous issue. This tactic is also not unique to Bill. It also mirrors several other stories of bi men in the archives, such as Brent Fuqua's interview in an earlier episode of Bi Cities, where Brent, a musician, newsletter editor, and Lavender writer covering underrepresented bi and trans communities, positions himself as welcoming to a potential straight, gay, and lesbian allies who ask annoying questions in good faith, and disappointed, though empathetic, with the larger gay and lesbian community's reception of him for being bisexual. Ike Frank, a Black feminist man writing for the 1997 Kansas newsletter Bi Focus, also cites similar levels of disappointment with the continued response of gay and lesbian communities, citing those communities as where he feels biphobia is most present. Nearly all of these men make it clear their goals are aligned with queer activism and wish for coalition building. These writings are circulated in bi and queer spaces where gay, lesbian, trans, and bi communities and potentially straight partners in bi communities are exposed, but not larger straight communities. Many of these arguments also end with an appeal to gay and lesbian communities for change. The aim here is not merely to chastise or critique for relative privilege, but to call for a shifting of community norms, first by expressing who they are and who they're aligned with, and then expressing how the larger community has failed to include who they are. That is to say, one strategy masked by activists employed in their work is a presenting of themselves as inclusive and coalition-centered, someone who has, through their activist presence, that doesn't reject identities other than their own, earned a place in the gay community that is denied to them on an untenable basis. By referring to their material efforts in this community, they rhetorically present themselves as invested members, though erased, attempting to shift community norms away from exclusionary practices, pushing for the inclusion and unity of themselves and others instead. This is just one example of how masked bi folk express their values that I've located in the archive. While of course these values are not unique to masked bi folk, most of these individuals are inspired by bi-feminism in the decade prior. It's nonetheless important to see examples of how masked folk worked in our communities to model inclusivity and call out exclusionism. Given the common discourse that Andrew just talked about, pointing to the lack of apparent bi men in our activist communities and the constant struggle to rediscover our lost histories, it becomes vital to remember that even if we were less present, we did exist, and there are examples to follow and iterate on. It's already been personally valuable to me, as rereading the efforts of local activists like Bill has pushed me to reach out repeatedly to the currently existing local orgs and former activists, and even convinced me to submit the proposal for this presentation. Yeah, so thank you. That's what I got. Here are my references. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you, Luke. That was an amazing work of ethnography and historical points on the bi activism and bi masculinity, health, and a lot of issues that actually involved us. So thanks, good job. That's pretty great. We can see your screen. Oh no, this is okay. This is Ritch. Hello, Ritch. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Feel free, you now have, as we said, like you missed the first part, but it's okay, you just have 12 minutes, and just if we can try to leave 3-4 comments or questions. And of course, if you have any questions for Luke, please write them in the comments, and then we can try to find some times to ask them and to answer to all the questions, because then we're having 4 great discussions today and speakers. So thank you, Ritch, and
thank you. Thank you very much, and sorry for my tardiness, but I'm here. So what I want to do is sort of present a more psychological sort of perspective here. And I want to just say that, you know, by definition, and this is real key, bisexuality means attracted to both sexes, and or if there's more, multiple sexes, and is both sexually, romantically, or both. And we tend to ignore the romantic aspect of bisexuality, incredibly so, something that needs to be corrected. In most research, we see that about 5% of the population identifies as bisexual. And that's the key, identifies as bisexual. That doesn't mean necessarily only 5% of the population is bisexual. So many bisexuals, for example, don't identify, they might identify as straight. And there's an incredible sense that maybe a lot of bisexuals actually skip the question altogether for various reasons, or they say, I'm something else. And as a result of that, they are omitted from the data set. And so we actually know almost nothing about those bisexuals unless they very clearly identify as such. Now, the research clearly shows that more women identify as bisexual than men. I seriously doubt that that is actually truth. From my perspective, I believe there are as many men as women who are bisexual, but men don't identify for various reasons, which I think we can imagine what those might be, but I think it's pretty profound. It's also important to understand that there's an incredible generational shift going on here, and we are in the midst of it. And that millennials, Zoomers, and alphas, the most recent generation, they have not the hesitations that we do to say, I'm bisexual in whatever way they choose to endorse that. So for example, is it 5% or is it more? So if you go by attractions, not identity, but do you have attractions to both sexes, either sexual, romantic, or both? Suddenly you have 14% those who identify either as bisexuals or pansexuals. And by the way, we usually omit pansexuals altogether because we don't know what in the hell to do with them, because they're not fitting into one of our 3 categories of gay, straight, or bi. Then there are the straight people who identify as straight, but actually are attracted and maybe even have sex with same-sex others. Then there are those who are mostly gay, and usually those are just combined with gay people because we don't really believe that a person who is so predominantly gay can actually be attracted to the other sex as well. So it's important to count them. Then there are those who say they're queer, kink, or trans, and I'm saying maybe 1% of the population. Those who are questioning or they don't know what their label is, 1%. And then there's a 2%, and these are conservative numbers, by the way. So who don't respond to the question. And of course, we don't know what happens to those people because we just delete them. All told, if you add that up, basically 25% of the population, I would maintain, is bisexual. Not 5%, but 25%. And everything we know about bisexual in the social sciences literature is focused on that 5%, not the much larger population of 25. And I think we would get a very different perspective if we could be more inclusive in our research. For example, there are the mental health. That's interesting. Let's try this technique. Okay, there we go. So that a national report just said that bisexuals suffer dramatic disparities in depression, anxiety, self-harm, you could just name it. And by comparison to not only straight people, but also gay and lesbian people. And they actually talk about their compromised life, and it's because of social biphobia that causes them to experience the stress and invisibility. But there are different, I will say types, though I hate the word types, but there are different varieties of bisexuals. And clearly there are those who are maybe those who identify, who are by their arousal, behavior, and identity, they are really, truly proud and out to be bisexuals. And once again, it's not 50-50. Almost no bisexuals in this universe, as far as we know, is exactly 50-50. That just doesn't exist. That's an issue which we're just maybe beginning to try to understand. So there are then the closeted bisexuals who are similar to the primary ones, but for whatever reason they choose not to be out. And this is a fairly large number, and it can be for personal, political, cultural reasons. They just know they don't want to come out as bisexual. Then there are the transitional bisexuals, and we're not quite sure what to do with them, but these are people where they think, well, it's a phase, I'm on the way to something else, such as being lesbian or gay. And I think this is where a lot of men find themselves. For example, if you were to count out the total number of men who have sex with men, the vast majority would be straight men, not gay or bisexual men. Then there are the situational bisexuals. Are these really truly bisexuals? How do we count them? They may be in an all-male setting, such as prisons, gangs, prep schools, convents, frats, sororities. And why are they engaging in same-sex behavior? Maybe it's an experiment, maybe it's pleasure, maybe it's power, maybe it's resources such as money or drugs, and it may or may not be related to sexuality. And then there are the individuals who are simply very hypersexual, and they have a lot of curiosity, they have a strong sex drive, and maybe these are the kinds of things that motivate them to engage in sexual activities. Some fall in love with their best female friend, a passionate friendship, or their best male buddy. And is this related? Are they really bisexuals? Do we count them? No, we don't count them. But shouldn't they be? Because in reality, they are attracted to multiple sexes. And then there are the queer bisexuals. And these tend to be maybe the more straight-oriented people who might identify or say they're bisexual for political or cultural reasons. We know very little about them. And then there are those, which I think is why our research is distorted, who are clinical bisexuals. And I would say these are not really bisexuals because they have a pretty severe mental illness, such as bipolar, OCD, or borderline. And as part of their disorder, they identify as bisexual as part of the larger scope. They readily volunteer in many cases in our research. And so do they distort our research such that we believe bisexuals are sick and depressed and mentally ill? So there certainly are negative stereotypes of bisexuals, but if in fact this small group is volunteering, and they are more likely to because we recruit our bisexuals from clinical caseloads, or online support groups or political support groups or friendship networks, we're not likely to get a representative sample of the true number and body of bisexuals. And if they constitute just a 15% of our total, they will distort the findings on mental health. But my big issue, and this is the one that I will close with because I am so yuck about this, is that there's such a vast literature that does not say anything at all about the contributions that bisexuals have, or fluid or pansexuals, to our culture, to our sense of self. And what are those? Well, we don't know because we never ask people. We assess their mental health, but what psychology almost never does is to actually entertain the possibility that they are a unique group. Perhaps they bring creativity, artistic ability, a sensitivity about the way the world is to the table. And I think it's those individuals and their contributions that we don't have a lot of information on. Okay, I'll stop there. Entertain questions.
Okay, thank you, Rich. There's a lot to say, I think. Let's see. Yeah, you are on time, so let's see if there's some questions from the chat. Some say all of the reasons people have mentioned about could be, oh yeah, so on the chat there's a discussion about why there's low self-identification of bisexual men. It could be similar to those seen in the asexual and ace community. And here Tamara says, for reference from the last report published by the ace community survey team from 2019, 13% of people surveyed identified as men, 60% as women, and 20% none of the above. So probably are non-binary ace or aromantic people. So I guess there's a lot of reason for why bisexual and bi plus men identify less. I think it has a lot to do more with the historical erasure and kind of destruction of bisexual identity in gay and lesbian circles. And of course, the forcing of...
Well, it's the mandate that we give men of the way they're supposed to be. And I think for many men, it's like if they have a little bit of gayness, then that makes them gay. And women don't seem to have that sort of complexity or that kind of assumption that if you are a little bit attracted to women, that makes you lesbian. And besides, it matters less to women, it appears from the research, whether they are lesbian or not to the extent that men. Now, what I'm hoping is that the current generations and new generations of men will not be as alarmed, or that they might actually take that as a, yeah, I am, and good. Because that makes me more interesting in whatever way. I just don't believe that there is an unequal number, despite what all the literature shows, because I think the literature, as I've tried to indicate, is very flawed in my estimation. And I am a psychologist, so.
Does anybody have any question? Because then I can just give a small comment and then we pass to the next speaker. I think we can be kind of optimistic, like if we look, so following psychological literature, if we look at Lisa Diamond review of population studies on bisexual orientation and attraction, they are the majority between the LGBT people, which of course it's about orientation. So there's no, trans people have a different, trans people have a sexual orientation, they are not a sexual orientation. And which are the majority. And the recent Gallup polls and many surveys show that for the Gen Z, most of them have non-exclusive identities, and most of them identify as bisexual. So I think we can be kind of positive in the next generation, and that we have to, as bi plus people and researchers and activists, I think we just have to protect the new generation from the kind of biphobia that we faced from from our generations, from mine, yours, and all this generation, because then protecting bi plus and trans youth is important, because then they might not feel safe enough to identify. And I think we should also make men more safe to identify as queer and to queer themselves and to explore gender. But that's a lot of that's a big discussion. Okay, we of course have to give a lot of space and time to a great research. Where's that? Sorry, not finding the schedule. So please welcome Rowan House from the University of California, Davis, also USA. They are going to talk us about sex without love and how hegemonic masculinity holds bisexual fathers. Sorry, can I read all the title? Fathers back from talking sexuality with their children. So, which is also, of course, what we're going to talk about. So please inspire us, Rowan, and thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. So yeah, my name is Rowan House. I'm a PhD candidate in the sociology department at the University of California, Davis. And this presentation is a brief summary of one of my dissertation chapters titled Sex Without Love, How Hegemonic Masculinity Holds Bisexual Fathers Back from Talking About Sexuality with Their Children. So my dissertation broadly covers the ways that bisexual parents navigate conversations about sexuality with their children. And although I'm not presenting on it today, one of my chapters is called The Bisexual Parent Advantage, and it's all about the positive attributes that bisexuals contribute to their children. So I hope that you all will be excited to read that once it comes out. But for this particular chapter of my dissertation, I'm looking at the gender differences in the ways that bisexual parents talk to their children about sexuality. So this was not something that I necessarily anticipated in my research, but it's a finding that sort of emerged after I talked to a lot of bisexual parents. I realized that men and women were sort of talking about their bisexuality differently from one another. So I wanted to sort of explore that in this chapter. Here's a very brief overview of my sample. I interviewed 19 bisexual fathers, 16 were cisgender, 3 were transgender, 41 bi mothers, and 11 non-binary parents. I also interviewed several gay and lesbian parents for comparison, but they're not relevant to this chapter at the moment. And my interviews are spread across the United States. So some are in rural areas, some are in the South, some are in Midwest. They're, spread all out. So we have sort of a wide array of experiences and backgrounds in this study. So first, I'm going to tell you my key findings, and then I'm going to dig into each of those findings with some examples from my interviews. So the first overarching difference I found in terms of gender was that bisexual women and non-binary people were defining their bisexuality differently than bisexual men. So bi women and non-binary people, they tended to define their bisexuality in terms of romantic attraction, and they often describe their bisexuality as a larger part of their social identity. So they talked a lot about, being involved in the queer community and what it meant to relate to people as a bisexual person. They talked about experiences with marginalization and how that shaped the way that they interact in the world. Bisexual men tended to define their bisexuality in relation to sexual attraction, and they described their bisexuality as a more private part of themselves. Now, this is sort of a broad claim. This is a pattern that I noticed. So of course, not all bisexual men fall into this category, but when sort of looking at things categorically, looking at patterns, this is the pattern that I was seeing. And then I think that this difference in defining bisexuality went on to influence this gender difference that I observed in how parents talked to their children about bisexuality. So I found that bisexual mothers and non-binary parents tended to talk openly about their bisexuality with their children. They used bisexuality as a stepping stone for educating their children about LGBTQ topics more broadly. And often they talked to young kids. It felt very sort of normal and open to talk about their bisexuality from an early age with their children. Bisexual fathers, on the other hand, tended to share less about their bisexuality with their children. A lot of times they articulated that they felt like talking about bisexuality with their children was similar to talking about their sex life, which felt inappropriate for reasons we can understand. So bisexual fathers who did talk to their children about their bisexuality, it tended to be like waiting until children were older, having like a brief coming out moment, but not really digging into what that meant for them, and not really using it as more of a stepping stone for other conversations. So looking first at this overarching finding of gender influencing how people define their bisexuality, I just want to show you a few examples from the quotes that I have with bisexual fathers. And bear in mind, in the chapter, I show comparative data. So I look at the ways that bisexual women and non-binary people talk to their children as well, or talk about these things as well. But for the purposes of brevity, I'm just going to show some quotes from bisexual men here. So one overarching thing that I found was that bisexual men tended to articulate that they had bisexual attraction, but not biromantic attraction. And here's a couple examples of that. John said, "For me, I would just say maybe a physical attraction toward males and females, possibly emotional, but I'm not sure. I lean more towards one than the other as far as that is concerned. For me, it's mostly the physical thing." And he clarified to me that he's emotionally attracted to women. But yeah, in terms of men, he's just not quite sure if there's an emotional component there. Henry is a little bit more blunt about this. He says, "I have absolutely no romantic interest in men. It's purely a sexual attraction. As I like to say, I'm not interested in the whole package. I'm just interested in the package." So you can understand Henry's priorities there. And this sentiment was shared across several of the interviews that I had with men. Another interesting thing that came up in these interviews in terms of how men understood sexuality was that the term sexuality often literally meant sex. Whereas I was sort of, as a non-binary person, as someone socialized as a woman, I went into these conversations thinking about sexuality the way that a lot of bisexual women do, which is in terms of identity, in terms of like experiences with marginalization, connection to the community. But oftentimes when I used the term sexuality with men, they thought I was literally talking about sex, like the physical experience of sex. So here's some examples of that. John said, "When you said we're going to talk about your sexuality, I'm like, oh my God, what would they ask me? Like what positions?" So sort of beckoning to the bedroom. Similarly, I asked Parker, I said, "What do you talk about most often with your wife when you do talk about your sexuality?" We had been having a conversation just before about whether or not his wife knew he was bisexual. And he said, "Most often it's definitely my #1 fetish, wanting your partner to feel the greatest thing they can ever feel." Not really related to his bisexuality at all. And then finally, I asked Tim, "Do the two of you and your wife, often talk about your shared identity as bisexual?" And Tim said, "I think we talk about mine more than we do hers. I'm a much more sexual person than she is. I've always been borderline obsessed with sex." So again, beckoning back to sexuality means sex, and understandings of bisexuality feel very attached to that like physical experience with sex. And now I want to look at those gender influences of how parents talk to their children about bisexuality, which I think, again, are very informed by the ways that people are defining their bisexuality differently. One overarching theme that I found in a lot of my participants was they felt that their sexuality was private. So here's an example from Brian. He said, "For the most part, I just keep my bisexuality to myself and occasionally engage in some online exploration, internal exploration, but not really naming it. I don't really talk to her, my daughter, about it. It's kind of the same reason I probably wouldn't talk about sex that way with her, just generally." A lot of the men that I spoke with shared this sentiment. Several of them were not out to their family members, some of them, not out to their wives. And even the ones who were out to certain people often just felt like it wasn't something that they wanted to talk about very much. So people might know, but it wasn't something they were going to like dig into and have conversations about. As an extension of this, a lot of bisexual fathers articulated this idea that talking about their sexuality felt inappropriate. So I asked Parker, "Do your kids know that you're attracted to multiple genders?" And his response to that was, "I heard of a lot of kids like myself who don't want to think about their parents' sexuality in any way at all. And I'm still grossed out by all the sexual things I know about my parents. Few people are like, yeah, I'm glad I walked in on my parents. I want to let them know that I'm open and accepting to all kinds of ideas, but I don't want to in any way tell them my fetish." So Parker is equating his bisexuality here to a fetish. And it makes sense if that is the framework of why that might feel uncomfortable to talk to your children about. If he's thinking telling them I'm bisexual is the same as them walking in on me having sex, we can understand why that might feel uncomfortable. So I want to explore why this gender difference exists, because I think it's quite an interesting difference that we're seeing here. And as a sociologist, I'm going in with the theory of hegemonic masculinity, which we've already touched on a bit today. Here's a really basic definition of that. It's a framework that acknowledges the existence of multiple forms of masculinities and femininities and says that there's one ideal form of masculinity which we're all measured against. This is a theory developed by Ray and Cornell. So I'm going to show you some attributes that are associated with hegemonic masculinity. I want you to picture in your head like the most powerful man in society that you can imagine. What does he look like? You know, what is his personality? Likely he has some of these attributes, and these are just a few attributes associated with hegemonic masculinity. So he's probably courageous, strong, white, cisgender, able-bodied, heterosexual, competitive, emotionally restrained. The list goes on. Heterosexuality is talked about very closely with hegemonic masculinity. There's a lot of research on how heterosexuality is attached to the system of power and how men are measured up against this expectation to be heterosexual. Power is very closely linked to this. We can understand this. You know, the privilege of being heterosexual gives people power in our society. We know that. So looking at this connection, research does suggest that men have more to lose by identifying as non-heterosexual, again, because masculine heterosexuality is attached to societal power. Now, of course, women can lose power as well, coming out as non-heterosexual. But the difference here is that sometimes in certain contexts, women can actually gain a little bit of societal power by coming out, especially if their sexuality is attached to a like more masculine gender presentation. There's research that shows that sometimes lesbians and bisexual women can gain a little bit of power in the workplace when they're not heterosexual. So another component here, when I talk to my interviewees, bisexual men, bisexual women, everyone seemed to agree that bisexuality was more heavily stigmatized for men, talking about how there's associations with STD, bisexual men bringing STDs into the straight community, how bisexual men are secretly gay, a lot of stigmatization towards bisexual men that can feel really overwhelming. So my response to this is that I believe bisexual men sometimes make patriarchal bargains in order to deal with this stigma and fear of loss of power. A patriarchal bargain is a deal in which an individual or group accepts or even legitimates some of the cost of patriarchy in exchange for receiving some of its rewards. So I'm sort of suggesting that bisexual men sometimes de-romanticize their bisexuality or keep their bisexuality private in order to maintain certain privileges associated with heterosexuality. I know there's a conversation going on that's very important about bisexual visibility and about people wanting it not to be perceived as straight. But this is sort of separate from that conversation of there are like several men who actually are saying they don't want more visibility. They actually prefer to keep their bisexuality private. The other connection here to hegemonic masculinity is emotional restraint. Majority of bisexual men that I spoke with are in straight appearing relationships, and that's true of bisexual men in general, we know from research. And you know, this is no surprise. In different gender relationships, women are expected to do more emotional labor, more care work, whereas men are expected to provide financially. This expectation continues even in our contemporary society. And what I found is that talking about sex is considered care work. It's feminized labor. Having sexual education with your children is a task that women tend to take on. And the bisexual men that I spoke to tended to say that their wives were responsible for sex education, which meant that there wasn't actually an opportunity often for them to talk about their bisexuality because that was a feminized form of labor. And I'll just show you a quote to sort of illustrate that. Joseph said, I was never very good with having conversations like that about sexuality. It felt very awkward. I felt very awkward about it. My wife brings up that as a sore point frequently. She had to have those discussions with the kids. We did have conversations while I was driving my son to college about consent and protection and stuff like no means no. It was a short conversation. I never really had those intimate conversations with them to talk about sexuality or stuff like that. So the bisexual women that I spoke with, they talked about their bisexuality as a part of their sexual education that they gave their children. And bisexual men are saying, well, I'm not really involved in sex education, so that opportunity isn't coming up in the same way. So I'll wrapping up here. Essentially, the argument that I'm making is the consequences of identifying as bisexual are sometimes higher for men due to hegemonic masculinity. So bisexual fathers make patriarchal bargains by removing romantic language from their definitions of bisexuality and keeping their bisexuality private from their children. And in terms of implications, I believe that academics who are trying to reduce bisexual stigma need to also be invested in deconstructing hegemonic masculinity. I think that these things are really closely linked, and I don't think that we can have bisexual liberation and bisexual acceptance until we sort of deconstruct our expectations around masculinity. All right, thank you so much. And if you have questions, I know we're almost out of time for this time slot, feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. That was an amazing talk, and thank you for bringing all this up, especially on the point that just being bi plus does not mean that we liberate ourselves from patriarchal hegemonies and from some kind of close hegemonic masculinity and gender roles. So we need to do the work.
Absolutely.
Everyone has, and some people more than others, because there's also the kind of discourse about privilege. And I'm really glad. I had a different experience with bisexual fathers, which were also polyamorous, and how actually, yeah, they even avoid to discuss it. Whereas younger bisexuals, they were more interested in having this kind of conversation, which leads us to that young generation can actually are doing more to deconstruct this. And you having a lot of good comments about all of this research, and I think we have a good sections. Oh, you're still sharing?
That's not me.
That's you. Wait, okay, I'm interrupting. Okay, so I think there's a lot of people here working on fatherhood and parenthood for bi plus people, and that's great because bi plus parents are actually a lot of them. There's a majority actually, and we don't talk about them enough, and we don't support them enough, and that's also is related to gender roles. So actually our time has run out, but please contact all the speakers that you want to engage with, build a relationship. The conference is made for this. So I'm really happy to be your host, and look forward to see you in the next panel. So see you again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a good conference.